Okay, guys, so in this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave 5-star reviews. That's always very important. We're going to start off with essentially who we as the United States owe the most money to in the sense of a foreign country. And there was a really cool article that was done. It was reviewed by Robert C. Kelly, fact checked by Yara Perez, updated at the end of 2022. Originally created by Investopedia by Andrew Sebastian. What he said was basically the countries that we owe the most debt to, right, in the sense that they bought into our bonds and such, are the following groups. And the reason I wanted to do a video on this is that somebody aggressively commented that basically there was nothing to worry about. Essentially, China was not, even our number one, person that, we have a debt against and things like that. So we shouldn't be worried. That's not entirely accurate. Let me go through why. Japan currently holds a little bit around, a little bit above 1.3 trillion in Treasury securities. And that means they hold about 16.8% of foreign-owned U.S. debt. Okay, so Japan's the winner. They're top notch. They're at the very, very top spot right now. Howdy Liberty 1776. Howdy, howdy. Number 2 spot goes to China. China has 1 trillion in Treasury holdings. China currently holds around 13.79% of U.S. foreign debt. So, not number 1, which is Japan at 1.3 trillion, but China's at 1 trillion. So not exactly that far off from, the number 1 spot for how much debt we owe essentially to those countries. United Kingdom currently holds 647.4 billion as of mid 2022. So United Kingdom comes in at 3rd with an 8.36% of the total foreign debt that the USA owes. Ireland, which is because of taxes. Ireland, Luxembourg, places like that, they have ridiculously good tax structures for mega corporations. So as a result of that, you see mega corporations setting up their, giant headquarters in those particular places, become foreign entities, which get a bigger tax break from the US. So bottom line is Ireland holds around 334.3 billion in US debt, which is 4.31% of the total foreign debt. Now, Luxembourg, same gig, very preferential tax treatment, 325.6 billion in US treasuries, equaling a total of 4.2% of total foreign holdings. Now, what does this mean? I want to go into this other article that was written by The Balance. Man, they did a really good job on this article. A really, really good job. Thank you, Liberty 1776. I really appreciate it. Today, I actually wanted to make less about news and more about learning so that you guys could see what's going on, how it works, stuff like that. But we actually have a schedule coming out in the future on a weekly basis and then a monthly basis. It includes really cool, simple foods that the disabled and retired should try out, those who are on Social Security benefits. It also essentially talks about cool places where the retired and disabled should go visit. So we have a whole schedule of cool things for Social Security recipients to be a part of this channel. It's not just going to be how does disability work? It's going to be much bigger than that. All right. Now, they created this article, The Balance, basically by Kimberly Amadeo, reviewed by Robert C. Kelly, fact-checked by Lars Pearson, updated on January 19th, 2023, so a couple of days ago. Let's just go through the basics. I want to start right here. So a lot of people don't realize that there are essentially 2 types of debt, right? There's essentially, let me actually read the basic thing here. The U.S. national debt reached the debt ceiling of 31.43 trillion in January of 2023, which is, of course, the 19th day where basically, we hit the ceiling. The U.S. Treasury manages the U.S. national debt through its Bureau of Public Debt. That's the group that watches over it. The Bureau classifies that amount into 2 broad types. So this is important. This is the part where you've got to, figure out the difference here. So basically, you have intragovernmental holdings and debt held by the public. So you got intergovernmental debt and you have debt held by the public. Okay. Now, intragovernmental debt or intragovernmental holdings, it's about 1/5 of the debt held by the public. Okay. Intergovernmental holdings or debt, and I mean, these numbers change, but it's 6.875 216 trillion, whereas debt held by the public Actually, it should be like a 4-to-1 ratio. Well, whatever. Is about 24.508.97 trillion. So you're talking about a almost 7 trillion versus a 24.5 trillion scenario. Intergovernmental debt is the smaller one. Debt held by the public is the bigger one. All right, what is intergovernmental debt? The Treasury owes this part of the debt to other federal agencies. Okay, once again, intragovernmental debt, in between the agencies, right? In between the different agencies that exist within the United States. Howdy Online Hangover, howdy, very cool name, there you go. Intergovernmental holdings totaled more than 6.89 trillion in January 2023. So why would the government owe money to itself? Because some agencies, like the Social Security Trust Fund, wink, wink, take in more revenue from taxes than they need. Well, they kind of used to, but now the trust fund's got a problem, especially for the retirement. These agencies then invest in U.S. treasuries rather than stick this cash under a giant mattress. So what they're saying is they take your taxes, they put them into these bonds, and then the Treasury does magic, flips it around, and then pays you the money from it. This transfers the agency's excess revenue to the general fund, where it's spent. They redeem their Treasury notes for funds as needed. The federal government then either raises taxes or issues more debt to raise the required cash. Okay, cool. So which agencies own the most Treasury notes? Because this is what it comes down to. Who owns the most notes? Who's got to pay the most debt between the agencies? Bills and bonds are what we're looking at here. Well, obviously, the Social Security is by a long shot the number one when it comes to basically the most Treasury notes. The U.S. Treasury publishes this information in its monthly Treasury statement. The Social Security trusts, including the Federal Old Age and Survivors Insurance and Federal Disability Insurance Trust funds, held $2.71 trillion in treasuries as of December of 2022. Okay. The next largest agency was the Military Retirement Fund at $1.36 trillion. So the Social Security Fund at that time when they did the metric was $2.71 trillion. But remember, that's the civilian one. That's everybody's paying into that one. Versus the retirement fund, which is 1.36 trillion, which is pretty close to 2.7 when you think about it. All the military people versus essentially the civilians. Okay. Other large holders of debt include the Office of Personal Management Retirement, right? So they've got those specialty programs that federal workers can pay into. Those are the ones that are most at risk during this whole debt ceiling crisis situation. Medicare, which includes the Federal Supplemental Medical Insurance Trust Fund. Then cash on hand to fund the federal government operations, okay? So that's all your intragovernmental, but Social Security is the big one. And a lot of people didn't realize there's a whole reinvestment thing going on with the money they pay in and taxes to the Social Security trust funds and the Social Security benefits in general. There's a whole reinvestment thing involving specialty bonds, blah, blah, blah. All right, cool. So, yeah. A real Ponzi scheme. It is. Now, the public, now we're going to talk about essentially public debt because public debt's the biggie, right? The public holds over 24.53 trillion of the national debt as of January 2023. Now, remember, we're comparing this against the 31.5 trillion deep we are. If you want to imagine how deep we are, we're almost always being chased by the mafia deep in debt as the United States. So bottom line is the public out of that 31.5-ish trillion, well, that public debt is 24.53 trillion. So that's the lion's share. The foreign governments hold a large portion of the public debt, while the rest is owned by U.S. banks and investors, the Federal Reserve, state and local governments, mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and holders of savings bonds. So remember how we went through essentially this whole public debt thing? So essentially, when you're talking about these groups, Japan 1.3 trillion, China 1 trillion, United Kingdom 647.4 billion, Ireland 334.3 billion, Luxembourg 325.6 billion. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about big money there. Okay. All right. The Treasury breaks down who holds how much of the public debt in a quarterly Treasury bulletin. Foreign and international investors held over 7.4 trillion. Okay, so that, and that's according to December 2022 bulletin. So that's what's usually flung around in the news to scare people about how much we owe China. Now, to be fair, when you owe a foreign nation that's not so cozy to America's interests, when you owe them $1 trillion, that's not usually good. Now, the U.S. doesn't really restrict who can invest into their bonds because the U.S.'s goal is to basically have people become heavy tilt without any pullback. We're talking like, you're full tilt, you're full lean, and there's no option for coming back. And the reason why is when the U.S. takes on more debt, it creates more validity that the U.S. has the capacity to pay it back, and that it is essentially a country that you can rely full faith and credit on its ability to pay it back, which is ironic because it relies on us, the humans of the United States, to make the money for people to gauge whether or not they should invest into the United States when it comes to their bonds and securities in general. All right, so state and local governments held about 1.55 trillion, and mutual funds had about 2.84 trillion. So the biggie is basically foreign and international investors around $7.4 trillion. Other holders of public debt include insurance companies, U.S. savings bonds, private pension funds, and other holders, including individuals, government-sponsored enterprises, brokers and dealers, banks, bank personal trusts, and estates, corporate and non-corporate businesses, and other investors. So basically anybody can buy into it. And the reason they buy into it is that usually the U.S. is a pretty stable growth pattern when it comes to essentially bond market growth, when it comes to security growth, etc. All right. That's why when they look at this debt ceiling situation and they look at the problem that could potentially be created by not, paying its loans on time, as the United States government, that would greatly reduce our securities rating. And then that would essentially collapse some portions of what we're doing. Because remember, a lot of our Social Security benefits rely on those bond ratings of the United States. Now, if you were to add the debt held by Social Security and all the retirement and pension funds, almost half the U.S. Treasury debt is held in trust for retirement. Once again, let me say that again, retirement is the biggie here. The current future retirees would be hurt the most if the U.S. ever defaulted on its debt. So the point of this that I wanted to do as an educational thing is that people understand the group that has the most to lose if there's a debt ceiling crisis that starts to hurt the rating system of U.S. debt, whether it's intergovernmental or public, would be the retirees. Because essentially that recycle where they take the money in, they invest it into the U.S., and then the U.S. turns around and sells it. If the bonds aren't paying out as much because the rating drops, guess what? We have a massive malfunction. And instead of it taking to 2034 for this trust fund to run out, because remember, it's not just a trust fund, it's also what people pay in each year. So there's extra money there. But the point is, you would take it from 2034 and just start whacking off those years and taking off those years and weed whacking them right off the top. Because, you could take it down to 2033, 2032, 2031, 2030, etc. Because we rely heavily on our debt's capacity to be paid. You drop the ratings on those, the retirees are going to see some very bad days. Okay. So we'll go through kind of the last little part here, and then I'm going to go ahead and end the video because I have to review one more case file for a hearing tomorrow. Why the Federal Reserve owns treasuries. As a nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve is in charge of the country's credit. Credit is like, how creditworthy are you as a person? How creditworthy is the country to lend credit to? Put another way, we lend credit to things that are creditworthy. Put another way, we lend credit to things that are likely to pay the money back. Cool. All right. It doesn't have a financial reason to own treasury notes. So why does the federal government do that? The Federal Reserve actually tripled its holdings between 2007 and 2014. The Fed had to fight the 2008 financial crisis, so it ramped up open market operations by purchasing bank-owned mortgage-backed securities. The Fed began adding U.S. Treasuries in 2009. It owned 1.6 trillion by 2011, maxing out at 2.5 trillion in 2014. Put another way, they're reinvesting into themselves to go ahead and create stability. This quantitative easing, QE, stimulated the economy by keeping interest rates low and infusing liquidity into the capital markets. But another way, it basically kept people having faith in the system, getting loans, buying stuff, whatever. It gave businesses continued access to low-cost borrowing for operations and expansion. Put another way, businesses could borrow money more easily, which means they would grow. If businesses are growing, the country is making a higher GDP, gross domestic product. Put another way, the country's just making more money. And then investors are like, cool, this company, notice the United States, is making more money. They might be even more creditworthy for us to go ahead and buy into more of their securities. The Fed purchased treasuries from its member banks using credit that it created out of thin air. Yeah, they can do that. I know we can't, but they can. It had the same effect as printing money. By keeping interest rates low, the Fed helped the government avoid the high interest rate penalty it would incur for excessive debt. Now, look, these are things that the federal government will do to go ahead and offset a fail and bail situation. As you know, we recently had a fail and bail situation known as COVID. That's what they're worried about. That's what Yellen is talking about. That's what, these imminent disastrous situations are, where they're trying to shift money here and do things and reinvest into themselves, whatever. Note, the Fed ended quantitative easing in October of 2014. Interest rates on the benchmark 10-year Treasury note rose from a 200-year low of 1.43% in July of 2012 to around 2.17% by the end of 2014 as a result. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, said the Fed would begin reducing its Treasury holdings in 2017. Right, they're starting to offload them because they have to kind of reevaluate and get back to a reasonable amount. But it purchased Treasuries again just a few years later. On March 15th, 2020, we all know why, the Federal Reserve announced that it would purchase $500 billion in U.S. Treasuries and $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities over the next several months in an effort to stimulate the economy and support financial markets during the pandemic. The FOMC expanded quantitative easing purchases to an unlimited amount on March 23rd, 2020. Its balance sheet peaked at $8.96 trillion in April of 2022. So you're starting to see that this quantitative easing, it's a trick, but it's something we don't want to use all the time. And we used it even more for this than we did for the housing crisis. All right, in March of 2022, the Fed announced it would start reversing these purchases to remove money from the economy and combat inflation. The balance sheet had shrunk to $8.85 trillion by August of 2022. So April 2022, $8.96 trillion, down to $8.85 trillion by August 2022, which doesn't really sound like much of a shrink, but, you got to remember, it was bad. The whole financial situation was bad. Those stimulus payments, they cost a lot of money to the federal government, which caused this whole quantitative easing situation, which put us in even more of a pickle. Current foreign ownership of U.S. debt. So we just covered basically what was going on with that, some of those details. These has some other numbers. This says Japan is at 1.8 trillion, China 870 billion. Let's see, UK, second largest foreign holder, is now, I guess 2006 when it increased, it was holdings were at 699 billion. UK, third largest holder at 645.8 billion. Luxembourg holding 332.9 billion. That's a little bit different than this article, but point is, major players, similar spots. It's almost always Japan number one, China number two. Bottom line, let me read to you the summary from this article. I think it's pretty good. The U.S. national debt is the sum of public debt that's held by other countries, the Federal Reserve, mutual funds, and other entities and individuals, as well as intergovernmental holdings held by Social Security. That's what we always talk about, that stuff. Military retirement fund, Medicare, and other retirement funds. Many people believe that much of the U.S. national debt is owed to foreign countries like China and Japan, but the truth is that most of it is owed to Social Security and pension funds right here in the U.S. This means that the U.S. citizens own most of the national debt. That's true. The Social Security debt is the largest debt. But the problem is the way that they characterize it is that, essentially this debt, which we pay for And a lot of people think it just goes into a bank and just sits there with their name on it with like a separated little account. It doesn't. It doesn't. But the point is, when it comes to basically this system, they're right. The largest debt is the Social Security debt. And to be more specific, it's the retirement debt. These other countries, the trillions that we owe them is relatively small compared to, essentially, all these other intergovernmental debts, Social Security being a very major one, etc. But still, when you look at the amount Japan has, China has, Ireland has, it's too much. It's too much of them investing into us and there being a control issue. Now, most people on the financial sector will argue that China would not be likely to create a war with the United States because they are too financially connected. And they're right. That's true. However, remember, it depends on how much China wants to put at stake. And China can do things just like Japan, although Japan's unlikely to do it. But China can do things to threaten our ability to pay back the debt. And then when they call on our debt, right, when it's due, there's no deadline extensions and stuff like that, we're essentially owing money to an enemy who has the capacity to somewhat shape essentially what our ratings for our securities are as a country. And that's why people are worried. Is China likely to create a war with the United States because of their financial interconnection with us? No. But what does China want? Well, China's been kicked out of the space stuff that all the other nations share. China's been kicked out of some of the financial programs that all the other nations share. China is becoming more and more of an island in the sense of how they interact with all these other nations. That's not a good thing, because the more and more of an island they become, the more and more realistically they may want to go ahead and add to their island, to their empire. And they can go ahead and make things more difficult for us by essentially changing market values with their other funds that they have, thereby making it more difficult for us to value our securities at a higher level, which means that Social Security retired people who utilize these specialty bonds in the retirement trust funds end up getting screwed over, and the time for that trust fund to run out will become sooner and sooner and sooner and sooner. Remember, that 2034 deadline, right, where they're saying that's when the retirement trust fund will run out, that's essentially based off of everything going somewhat in the right direction and us not having another major kerfuffle, right? So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it kind of educated you on how some of the stuff works. We will continue tomorrow with basically some more things. I have some really big videos for tomorrow, but have a wonderful, wonderful night, and I will catch you later. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave 5-star reviews. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.